The North African country of Sudan marks a grim anniversary this week. The Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces have been fighting this civil war for 3 years, creating the world's worst humanitarian crisis. By some estimates, 150,000 people or more have been killed. The disastrous conditions make it nearly impossible to get an accurate count. We do know that about 14 million people have been forced to flee the fighting, often multiple times, and 4.4 million have sought refuge in other countries, mostly in Chad, South Sudan, and Egypt, but also some in Europe. Today, 1 in 4 Sudanese is displaced. The UN says 21 million Sudanese are facing acute food insecurity, including 6.3 million in the most dire state of food emergency. Both sides in the war have been accused of committing atrocities against civilians, including children, ethnic cleansing, extrajudicial killings, sexual violence. In January 2025, then Secretary of State Antony Blinken determined that the RSF and allied militias had committed genocide in Darfur in 2023. And one of the most shocking massacres occurred even more recently, after the RSF seized control of the city of al-Fashir in North Darfur from the Sudanese armed forces last October. According to the UN, mass killings around al-Fashir killed some 6,000 people in 3 days. And those are just the numbers that have been verified. Fierce attacks continue in Darfur, the Kordofan states, and Blue Nile state, with the use of air bombardments and drones recently increasing. The U.S.-Israel-Iran war is making things worse. Stanford University lecturer Rachel George reported in a recent article for Just Security about the impact of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz on humanitarian supply shipments, such as food and fertilizer, and the effect of the Iranian air attacks against Dubai, which had become a regional humanitarian supply hub. How did Sudan, which just 7 years ago was embarking on a democratic transition, get to this point? How has the international community responded or failed to respond? And where does this go next? Joining us to talk about the crisis in Sudan is Quscondy Abdulshafi. He's a research fellow at the Simon Schott Center for Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He has more than a decade of experience working on governance, democracy, and human rights in Africa and the United States, and he'll be speaking with us today in his individual capacity. Quscondy, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, and thank you for taking time to talk to me. It's always wonderful to speak with the Just Security and the LAU.
Thank you. Quscondy, just for starters, remind us a little of why and how the war started in April 2023.
Yes, thank you again. And to everyone, yes, Sudanese has a very celebrated revolution in 2018, 2019 that toppled one of the toughest African dictators in the recent history, General Omar al-Bashir. And after that revolution, when the regime change happened, it was a coalition between the command of Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces, and which they took over the power. And the revolutionary civilian forces have a negotiation with those forces. And it was a rocky road in which they attacked the civilians, protesters, and, killed hundreds of civilians in Khartoum. But after that, the negotiation led into transitional arrangement in which the civilian formed a civilian branch of executive government, working in tandem with the military, transitional military council under the leadership of both RSF and the SAF. While the transition was going, the SAF and RSF both did a military coup, and they arrested the prime minister, the civilian prime minister, and declared a coup government led by both sides of this armed group, the regular army and their paramilitary. However, the civilians were more kind of having a conversation with the military to be able to create a new transitional arrangement in which the civilian to restore a past civilian government that can restore the path for a peaceful democratic transition in the country. In the middle of that process, there was unseen competition within the military barracks, that is between the Sudan Armed Forces and Rapid Support Force, as that suddenly exploded into one of the most devastating warfare in April 15, in which the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces started fighting each other in the military barracks in the capital Khartoum, and then subsequently to all parts of the country. Generally, the conflict was the struggle over control of the state power, in which the Rapid Support Force and the SAF commands were both fighting, especially Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Himeti, the commander of the Rapid Support Forces, and the General Burhan fought and competed over the power and control of the state power. And that is how the war started, and that is how it's been since then today.
What are some of the key ways that you have seen the fighting shifting over time, either geographically or in terms of tactics or in any other sense?
Yes, I think the war started in Khartoum within the military barracks and somehow transitioned into more like kind of a fragmented conflicts over territorial control, and throughout the time become more or less kind of less coordinated, especially on how the military warfare is being carried out. I think the shift, first of all, happened shift in tactics, shift on the tool of war, and shift on the more general kind of the objective of the war. In the beginning, the objective of the commanders were to seize the power. Throughout the time, as the war continued, the war mostly was to expand the territorial control and to gain the legitimacy and recognition, the international legitimacy and recognition, and then shifted even the tools of the war from the effective, active military to military confrontation of war by fire, and to most like kind of in the beginning was also a lot of tool for absolute destruction, looting and pillage of the cities and urban centers. But now become more tactical, where the technology is being applied very heavily. Means both parties have advanced drone war that some of them are very precise, especially the recent shift in the past 2 years. The arms supply is changing. For instance, the SAF that have no control in Darfur can be able to use a drone attack, precise drone attack in the region of Darfur, thousands of kilometers far. The same and RSF have a control and can be able to hit targets in the far north and as far as the far east in the Port Sudan, which shift the dynamic of the conflict, shift the dynamic of the violence. But one thing that remains constant is the consistent targeting of the civilians, and most visible, this is most visible into areas where the RSF conducts military operations, like what was happened recently in Al-Fashir, one of the most horrific atrocities that are very hard to even imagine that have been happening in Darfur. So the general shift was more now is like territorial control, exert legitimacy, which the RSF also formed with a kind of a parallel government that works mostly offshore. And then SAF here searching for recognition, for legitimacy, but also somehow to play with the game of the time. So the conflict have been a bit changed in the nature, tactics, in somehow, but one thing that remains constant is the civilian target and the magnitude of destruction that this war caused in anywhere where there is a military confrontation.
That's really helpful to understand the trajectory of the past 3 years and what's happened and how that's evolved. Thank you. And how has the international response evolved and changed over that time? Some foreign entities have come in support of the Sudanese armed forces and others in support of the RSF, right? And then there was also what has been the role of the United States and the European Union, for example?
Initially, when the conflict started, there was very strong diplomatic engagements and calls for ceasefires from the African Union, United States, and other international actors. Those pressures led to a peace negotiation or humanitarian cessation of hostility negotiation in Jeddah that was signed in May 2023. That was like almost, around a month when the war started. However, as the time continues, there's a lot of, lack of effectiveness into those diplomatic efforts. At least as the conflict continues, it failed to produce a significant ceasefire agreement. In some fronts, in the beginning of the first 2 years, was very difficult for the humanitarian access, causes a lot of famine and disaster. But now there is some sort of increased funding, but all of this also remains insufficient. And the actors still continue to use humanitarian access as a political tool and as a tool of war. And still, all this diplomatic effort were not able to change those games. So the international response has been there, is always up and down. But I think, and when it comes to the key actors, especially the United States and the African Union, there was less role within African Union, unlike in the previous conflicts where African Union was central, along jointly working with the United States. I think in the past 6 years, since the revolution, African Union become less visible. United States remains the key actor, but at this time, most of the U.S. works through the Middle East actors, which is the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. And that kind of new peace arrangements kind of with being what is called the Quad agreement, kind of groups that pressure impose peace agreement, that not being effective. And it didn't really work because you haven't that strong influence of the conflict in Sudan, like UAE and Egypt in the other side. It's very hard for them to be effective as well into some of the political questions that need to be to ensure continuous or effective cessation of hostilities.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Tell us a little bit more about this grouping that has been trying to mediate a resolution to this war. The African Union, the United Nations, the European Union, the Arab League, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, right? How did that develop and how effective have they been, if at all?
I think what is called the quintet, which is the most recent mediation tools, is the product of a continuous sustained failure of the Quad, which was United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, the US, UK, and others. And these are kind of and I think one of the centrality, like if you're seeing the history of the peace agreement in Sudan, since even the South Sudan peace agreement, Darfur peace agreement during the President Bush, and other subsequent peace agreement. The U.S. has been central into those political processes. I think the reason, because of the shift to the U.S. most kind of pushing up Middle Eastern, particularly the Saudi Arabia and UAE to play a role. And this happens after Sudan deployed the RSF militia in the war in Yemen against Houthis and others. Most the U.S. pushed its role in Sudan and gave it more working through what I could call the babysitters. And I think that babysitter agreement didn't work out because there is a very much conflicting interest within the babysitter corridors. That's Egypt, that's Saudi Arabia, that's UAE. And then, in the past 2 years, this effort did not bear any fruit because they were so much fragmented, and there is also uncoordination of the effort. So the quantity is came in to try to create more coordinations between all of these, scattered efforts around the region, Africa, Middle East, and, IGAD, which is more Horn African mechanism that have been historically played a very key role into the 2000 peace agreement that led into the secession of South Sudan, 2005 peace agreement. So I think this is an effort which is very important. I think it is helpful to have more coordination among the actors because it could be effective. I think the weakness is that there is no political leverage to put it on the table to be able to pressure for peace. There is lack of ideas of incentives or any leverage that can be enable the conditions to create a peace agreement or at least conducive environment for the armed actors to sign cessation of hostility. There is also, I think, historically the Quad, because of the nature of the governments that are key in the Middle East side, where it was an absence of civil society voice, which is central into any transition. And I think those conditions created more incentive to armed actors, and these incentivize non-armed actors into the political process. And hoping that the new process might create systems that could incentivize non-armed actors, bring civilian voice into the process, and can at least create some sort of new conducive environment possible. But so far, still, since this body is formed until now, there is no strong, visible action being taken so far.
That's very helpful. And it's really interesting to hear about all of those different shifts over time. In Sudan itself, Sudanese civil society has really came together at the start of the war to provide and coordinate humanitarian aid in the capital, Khartoum, and elsewhere around the country. What's happened with that effort over time?
Yes, because I think it's very important to note the centrality of the Sudanese civil society into the past 10 years of the political processes in the Sudan. And I think even the war that happened in April 15 was the fear of the armed actors that they don't have a guaranteed future into controlling the state and power, the power and the wealth of the state, as it has been throughout the years through the military camps. And that because of the power and the strength of the nonviolent civilian movement in Sudan. And because of that, they changed the context of the politics from the straight protest chanting where women and children play a key role, youth and women play a key role into that struggle, to an all-armed military warfare. And because of that, that shift have absolutely changed the narrative of the future of Sudan. And because of the international political system, unfortunately, it incentivizes the violent actors in any political processes. And that is very unfortunate truth that when a conflict happens, when there is a political problem, the first person to get the biggest seat in the table is the most violent one. Is the most violent, is the one who can kill more people and be more brutal. And that has been the reality of the politicking in Sudan, especially when it comes to mediation, international recognition, and peace process. But where the civilians of Sudanese civil society went, when the whole state collapsed, and all international organizations, diplomatic missions, everyone was running for their life outside the country, this civil movement stepped up and they become the de facto state providing service and aid where there is nobody. And they have been able to work until now in a very tough situation, being targeted by the armed actors without any protection. And I think that is where the conversation that we want to reframe the conversation around these actors and not around the armed actors. But there is no international mechanism through which such actors can get recognition in the armed or in the conflict context, which is very unfortunate. And because of that, the civilian voice is being fragmented, but also since the international system incentivizes armed actors on the account of non-armed actors, some of the political actors have tried to look through the corridors of armed actors, either SAF or RSF, to be able to leverage some of the to get a seat on the table. And as a result, you see many of, especially like people, some of the leaders who were in the previous cabinet, some of them went through the SAF. Others are living somewhere between UAE, at least in the corridor of SAF, of RSF and the United Arab Emirates, because that is in their vision where the power lies. So I think generally what I would say with regard to peace effort, cessation of hostility effort since the war started, civilians have been grown far. The bigger picture is that every year the war continues. The more the war continues, the more the civilian voice becomes remote. Unfortunately, in the past 2 years, not only civilian voice become remote, even the Sudanese armed actors' voice become remote, meaning that there is absolute absence of Sudanese voices into some of the key crucial conversation about ceasefire, cessation of hostility on Sudan, meaning that those who support the war, the UAE, either Saudi Arabia or Egypt, are the ones who lead the conversation with U.S. government and other diplomatic mission on what to do to stop war. And that is very dangerous when it comes to the future of the state, to have, absolute absence of those local national voices into some of those processes. But it also shows the amount of the power external actors have on the war and the violence in Sudan.
Yeah, those are all really important points. And that dilemma about the fact that in so many peace negotiations, it's the warring parties alone who are represented and their international supporters represented, but civil society, ordinary citizens, most often are not. And even though there is increasing research that shows that when civil society is involved, when women are involved in peace negotiations, they are more sustainable over the long term. But there's still that dilemma of how do you get the warring parties to the table with the civil society that are so profoundly affected by all of these conflicts. It has been a perennial issue in peace negotiations around the world, hasn't it?
In any peace negotiations, and the mediation process of any conflict, especially as complex as Sudanese conflict is now, you cannot be able to change the outcome unless being able to have a power to change some of the key factors of the negotiation. And that can be change the actors, mediation actors, or change the agenda, the key agenda, or at least being able to force armed actors to leverage some of the powers, to force the armed actors to be able to have more incentives into not going to the war. Currently, we have, there's tool for sanctions and all of this. It didn't help in stopping the war. The external actors, those who are supporting the war in Sudan, are very well able to continue their support, and those who have been able to carry out mass atrocities throughout the years, they remain fully protected, and impunity continues to be, kind of a very visible. Civilian voice is absolutely suppressed by armed actors, but also by the international actions. It is the situation to change. Some of these factors and conditions have to be reframed and have to be changed. And I think, there are opportunities because there's a body of civic voices that exists that so fragmented. It's present a lot of hope into changing, reframing the current narrative, and kind of opening windows. The internationals have a lot of power and ability to be able to narrate some and enact some of those policies, very good policies and frameworks that place, especially things like arm embargoes, the UN arm embargo, the sanction system, the other investigations that are going on the war crime. Those are kind of opportunities that can bring the civic voice up and can de-incentivize the armed actors from their continuation of the war.
Yeah, that's really interesting and really profound perspective there. Thank you for that, Quscondy. Quscondy, when was the last time you were in Sudan, and what do you remember about that compared to what you're hearing about the conditions now?
Yes, it's been a long time since I was in Sudan. I was in Sudan, the last time was in 2007. And at that time, that was a transition. There was a beginning of the peace agreement, lights of the stopping of the war in South Sudan. But there was, increasing violence, in my home region, Darfur, for instance, where I come from. And though it was chaos and there is a lot of, suppression, economic inequality, the cities, in particularly in the city, the structural kind of, working of the country that has been ruled for decades with the Islamists that have used, civil war and used, government tool to suppress groups and oppositions. I think that there are some sense of, people, very, voices of Sudanese at different aspects of life. In the cities, there was, people who are hoping to fight, and that was the one that culminated into a changing of the regime in 2018. I think the stories that come up now, just what is stick on my mind is, I was a year ago, one of my cousins was walking in Zalingi, and she just sent me a picture of my secondary school in Zalingi town, and it's being destroyed, but there is a picture of a video of somebody who was like checking out the windows. And they says like, who is that? Why they are destroying the school? And he said that they are taking it and they are putting it carrying it outside the city, somewhere in the bush to build shelters. And that is kind of a micro picture of the amount of destructions that happens, especially in the region where there is intensive RSF operations like Zalingi, like Al-Fashir, where hospitals, schools, whole entire state apparatus and things that people need for survival have been so deeply destroyed. That paints a very dark picture of what this 3 years of the war did to the country and what lies ahead for Sudanese with regard to reconstruction. This is like not only reconstruction of the absolutely demolished infrastructure, but also reconstruction of our future identity and, healing of all the things that people have been seeing and went through in the past years. And this because many of these people, and you say 13.6 million people displaced. And that number tells you one thing, that have never in the modern history of humankind happens a disaster which forces 13.5 million people to flee, not even in the World War. It happens, the highest number recorded was 11-point-something million population that fled during the Indian partition in 1947. And that was 11-point-something. And this, we're talking about 13.6 million. This is a disaster of a historic magnitude and of a unique characteristics that needs efforts beyond Sudanese to solve. And this is because, and one thing that makes this possible is that, Sudan has civil wars throughout since 1955. That was the year before the independence. None of them has been able to be this destructive because the one factor that makes this war different, I think there's two key factors that make this war different. First, this war started not in the village, not in the bush, as general civil wars in Africa looks like, as historically Sudanese civil wars look like. This war started in the Khartoum, the most center of the state, and went to other cities. The second, this is the civil war, unlike others, where external actors have so much invested, directly aiding and funding. The amount within the 5 or 6 years for RSF to have armed power that overpowers the Sudanese armed force that has national petroleum in hand since 1998, and one of the most corrupt, deep systems that built intelligence and security that's threatening not only Sudan, but whole the entire region. To overpower that is a lot of money in less than 5 years. And I think these are two factors: warfare in the urban center. The second factor is the heavy external investment. I think without being able to counter at least some of these factors, prevent atrocities or wars in the urban center, or control the armed flow and support of armed actors, it is very difficult for Sudanese civilians to kind of have to stop and reflect and see what can we imagine the tomorrow Sudan? How can we build? How can we start the reconstruction? And I think stopping the war is the key. Maybe even if war didn't stop, and it is somewhere not in the cities that we can build cities, we can open the universities, we can have hospitals. And throughout the time, the safety and stability in the city can help de-incentivize armed actors, de-incentivize young people from going to military to actually be able to build civil life in the cities. If those opportunities are not open, it's very hard for the new beginning for the Sudanese. But I feel like because of the amount of violence, the frustration goes the same way, and people feel the frustration of the war. Regions of Darfur now, you would see, destruction, new problems such as epidemics of drugs use and crime rates becoming increasing. And most of everyone is afraid of their lives, including those who have arms, who have unleashed this violence. So some sort of change is very urgent and it's very much needed. And that urgency is the quest for and the window of hope for ending this violence.
Thank you very much, Quscondy. That was a really important perspective and really moving to hear your reflections on the situation in Sudan. Are there any parting thoughts that you want to leave us with very briefly before we go on and try to focus more on Sudan going forward than we have, many of us have been able to do in the last 3 years?
Yes, I think, before the civil wars were very much fragmented, region-based, ethnic-based, and the violence the same. The targeted violence, people who are targeted were very much isolated. Either that was civil war in South Sudan, Blue Nile, South Kordofan, or Darfur. I think this war have touched everyone in Sudan. And with that also created some common sense to every household in Sudan that, war is not stories you hear, it's the reality that you have seen. And I think with that also comes like how Sudanese civil society and Sudanese civilians showed up to make, community kitchens, people of different colors, language, just Sudanese people. Come, just pick your lunch, eat, talk, speak, share stories, go back and come back for the next meal. People line up, doctors healing people in a very difficult condition, putting their life on line and continue to do that. I think that is an extraordinary picture of the resilience of the Sudanese people. Innovation, passion, and love for their country, love for their future. And that's also a platform for hope, for a stronger, peaceful country that everyone aspires to. And I think that is where the journey starts for the path forward, that centers the support of these local actors, empower these local actors. However disadvantaged they look, however fragmented, disorganized they look, they are the future for the country. And they present the Sudan that everyone wants to visit tomorrow, Sudan that every child wants to live in, Sudan that all those displaced now into this, outside the territories of the country, to neighboring country, to diaspora, want to go back and live in. So I think building start with, trusting our local partners, international, to be able to work with these groups and support them, but also all of us in diaspora to be able to strongly, create some sort of solidarity to amplify those voices and start building.
Thank you very much for those really inspiring parting words there, Quscondy. Really appreciate your being available and to have this conversation and hearing your perspective. And thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thank you always for the conversation and for reaching out. I really appreciate you and your team.
This episode was hosted by me, Viola Gienger, and produced by Maya Neer, with help from Pooja Shah and Clara Apt. Special thanks to our guest, Quscondy Abdulshafi. You can read all of Just Security's coverage of the war in Sudan on our website. If you valued this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.